the unprecedented struggles of the 2023-2024 Detroit Pistons. Welcome, basketball enthusiasts and sports aficionados. Today, we're diving into the unprecedented struggles of the 2023-2024 Detroit Pistons, a team that's not just bad, but on the verge of etching its name in the annals of sports infamy. From statistical anomalies to the challenges of a youthful roster, this is a story that goes beyond mere losses. It's a captivating journey through the complexities of professional sports. You see, this is what a losing team looks like, but not just the losing team of this particular game. A team that has lost more consecutive games than any team ever has in every single season in the history of pro sports in North America. The Pistons are really bad, but they're not just bad relative to this season. They're not even just bad for an NBA team. They are possibly the worst North American pro sports team ever, with 28 straight losses. How bad does a team need to be the worst team ever in North American professional sports? Pro sports have been around for over a century, starting with the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs in 1876, followed by the American League of Professional Baseball in 1901, forming the MLB in 1903. 14 years later, the National Hockey League was established in 1917, and then came the NFL, formerly known as the American Professional Football Association. 3 years later, in 1920, the fourth and final major sport didn't come about until 1946, when the Basketball Association of America was founded, known today as the NBA. Over the last 148 years, these four leagues have expanded and grown to now include 124 teams across 2 countries. 124 teams, nearly 150 years of history, thousands of individual team seasons, and yet throughout all of this, one team has to inevitably be the worst one. To do that, we have to pull out the record books. Here are the 10 worst teams in NBA history, according to win percentage. Now, it makes sense to use win percentage here over an actual number of wins, because every season does not have the same amount of games. For example, the Providence Steamrollers won just 6 games back in the Stone Age, but they only played 48 games the entire season. And then, of course, there are the 2012 Bobcats, who won just 7 games in a 66-game shortened season. I vividly remember this Bobcats team. They were so bad that the discourse around them that season wasn't about whether they were just the worst team in the NBA, it was about whether the Kentucky men's basketball team, a college team, could beat them in a game. This team was disgusting. And yet somehow the 2024 Pistons are losing more games than that Bobcats team did, even in a shortened 66-game season. The Bobcats managed to win 7 games. This season, with a full 82-game schedule, the Pistons are on pace to win just 5, which would essentially make them about twice as bad as the next worst team in NBA history. If we compare the Pistons to the worst teams in MLB history, they are still, by a massive margin, worse than any team that has ever played in Major League Baseball's 148-year history. The last time a team in Major League Baseball was even remotely close to as bad as this year's Pistons, the league sounded more like a branch of government than it did a professional sports league. The Colonels, the Nationals, the Senators, the Cowboys go back nearly 150 years, and still, you will not find a team as bad as this year's Pistons. But the worst team in MLB history, according to team records, was the Cleveland Spiders. Yes, this was a real team, and no, they were not as bad as this year's Pistons. Going 20-134 on the season, the Spiders had the worst winning percentage in league history, just 13.3%, which means they were still winning twice as often as Detroit is this season. Detroit's record at the moment would be the equivalent of an MLB team winning just 10 games in an entire 162-game season. But what about the NHL? Nearly 100 years of history. There's got to be one team that just couldn't win games, right? No, in 1975, the Washington Capitals were one of 2 teams added to the league in an expansion year. The team was built from scratch, sort of a Frankenstein of a roster loaded with free agents, young prospects, players who had never even played a minute of professional hockey in their careers, and bits and pieces from other teams. By no means was this team expected to win many games, and they didn't. The Capitals finished the season with the worst record in NHL history, winning just 8 games. But back then, NHL games could end in a tie, essentially giving half wins in those scenarios. So those 8 wins got the Capitals to a win percentage of 13.1%, very similar to the worst teams throughout NBA and NFL history, which makes the Pistons still far worse than the worst team in NHL history. That leaves us with the NFL, and as many of you know, there have been a handful of winless teams throughout the league's history. 5 potential wins are still better than 0 wins, right? Wrong. I believe that a team on pace to win 5 or 6 games in an 82-game NBA season is still worse than most, if not all, 0-win teams in NFL history. For example, take the most recent 0-win team in the NFL, the 2017 Browns, one of the 8 winless teams throughout the NFL's history. In that 2017 season, despite winning 0 games, the Browns had an average point differential of 1, meaning on average, they lost every single game that season by 11, which sounds bad because it is. And yet, that still only ranks as the 109th worst team point differential in league history. They were losing, but they were still competing. Compared to some other bad teams throughout the NFL's history, in fact, there have been teams who were losing games on average by twice as much as the 0-win Browns. But at least those teams still managed to win a game or 2. The Pistons, on the other hand, oddly enough, have a similar average point differential of 11.53, which is the 5th worst point differential in the history of the NBA. So they're not only losing damn near every game, they aren't even competing, and the 4 teams that were losing by more than the Pistons still managed to win double-digit games, or at least were nearly on pace to in a full season. The Pistons aren't just losing games, they are getting blown out in nearly every game. So now that we know, at least at this moment, the Pistons are worse than any NBA team ever, worse than any MLB team ever, worse than every NHL team that has ever taken the ice, and probably worse, if not as bad as the worst NFL teams ever. I think it's safe to say that, at the pace they're on, they could potentially finish this season as the worst major pro sports team North America has ever seen.
That's all for today's video. I hope you found our video interesting, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for latest updates.